They say your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. A day of white dresses and flower petals, of promises whispered and tears of joy. But what happens when that sacred day becomes your darkest nightmare? What happens when the man you trusted most, the man who was supposed to bless your union, becomes the monster who destroys it? Imagine standing in your wedding dress, minutes away from walking down the aisle, when someone you've known for years, someone your entire community reveres, violates you in the most unthinkable way. Imagine your groom waiting at the altar, unaware that in a locked room just feet away, your world is being shattered into a million pieces. This isn't fiction. This isn't a cautionary tale from some distant time or place. This happened in a small Pennsylvania church on a sunny Saturday afternoon in 2019, and what unfolded next would expose secrets that had been buried for decades, would force an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths, and would prove that sometimes the most ordinary people possess extraordinary courage when faced with unimaginable circumstances. The bride's name was Sarah. The groom's name was Michael. And the priest, well, his name would soon become synonymous with betrayal in ways no one could have predicted. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about trust, justice, and the institutions we're taught to believe in without question. Before we dive into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from. Are you in the US? Canada? South Africa? Somewhere else in the world? We love connecting with our viewers from around the globe. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now. We share real stories like this one, stories that matter, stories that make you think long after the video ends. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into what really happened on that wedding day, and I promise you, every detail of this story will leave you speechless. To understand how something this terrible could happen, you need to understand the world Sarah and Michael lived in. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, is beautiful countryside, rolling hills dotted with farmland, small towns where everyone knows everyone, where church isn't just a Sunday obligation but the center of community life. It's the kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked, where neighbors bring casseroles when someone is sick, where traditions matter and family names carry weight. Sarah Mitchell grew up in this world. She was 28 years old when this story takes place, the youngest of 3 daughters born to Robert and Linda Mitchell. Her father owned a small hardware store in town, the kind of place where locals gathered not just to buy supplies but to catch up on news and gossip. Her mother was a kindergarten teacher at the local elementary school, beloved by generations of children who still remembered her as their favorite teacher decades later. Sarah had grown up attending Cornerstone Community Church, a modest brick building that seated maybe 300 people on a crowded Sunday. She'd been baptized there as an infant, confirmed there as a teenager, sang in the choir throughout high school. The church wasn't just where she worshipped, it was where she'd learned to play piano at their Wednesday night music programs, where she'd volunteered for Vacation Bible School every summer, where she'd helped serve meals to the homeless at their monthly community dinner. For Sarah, faith wasn't an abstract concept. It was lived out in relationships, in service, in the daily choice to see good in people and believe in something bigger than herself. Michael Foster had moved to Lancaster County 5 years earlier, taking a job teaching history at the local high school. He was 31, originally from Pittsburgh, and he'd been drawn to the area by its slower pace and tight-knit community feel. Michael was the kind of teacher students loved, the one who made history come alive with stories and debates, who stayed after school to help struggling students, who showed up at their basketball games and theater productions. He was quiet in social settings, more of a listener than a talker, but when he did speak, people paid attention because his words were always thoughtful and carefully chosen. He had dark brown hair that was always slightly too long, glasses he was constantly pushing up his nose, and a gentle demeanor that put people at ease. Michael had been raised Catholic but had drifted away from organized religion in his 20s, disillusioned by scandals and rigid doctrines that didn't match his understanding of spirituality. When he moved to Lancaster County, he hadn't planned on joining a church. But a colleague had invited him to Cornerstone Community Church for their annual Harvest Festival, and something about the warmth of the community had drawn him back. It was there, 3 years before our story begins, that he first saw Sarah. She was leading a group of kids in some kind of relay race, laughing as they tumbled over each other, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face flushed with exertion and joy. Michael had been struck by her energy, her unself-conscious happiness, the way she seemed fully present in the moment. When someone introduced them later that evening, Sarah had a smudge of chocolate cake on her cheek and was so busy telling a story about one of the kids that she barely registered Michael's presence at first. But when she finally focused on him, her green eyes meeting his, something clicked. They'd started talking and didn't stop until the festival was over and volunteers were taking down tables around them. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully. Neither of them was interested in rushing into anything. They had coffee, then dinner, then long walks through the countryside on Saturday afternoons. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their beliefs, their dreams, their fears, their failures. Sarah learned that Michael's father had died when he was 16, leaving him to help his mother raise his 2 younger sisters. She learned that he'd worked 3 jobs to put himself through college, that he'd once wanted to be a lawyer but decided teaching was more meaningful. Michael learned that Sarah had struggled with anxiety in college, that she'd once been engaged to someone else but had broken it off when she realized they wanted different things from life. He learned that she volunteered at a domestic violence shelter, that she'd once considered becoming a social worker but decided she could make more impact through community organizing. What drew them together wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly there. It was recognition. They recognized in each other a similar worldview, a similar commitment to showing up for people, a similar belief that life's meaning came from connection and service rather than achievement and acquisition. After 2 years of dating, Michael proposed during a hike to their favorite spot overlooking the valley. It wasn't elaborate or showy, just the 2 of them and a simple question: will you build a life with me? Sarah said yes before he'd even finished pulling the ring from his pocket. They set a wedding date for September, giving themselves a year to plan. Sarah had dreamed of getting married at Cornerstone, the church that had shaped so much of her life. Michael, who'd come to love the community there, agreed immediately. They met with Father Richard Chambers to begin premarital counseling, a requirement at Cornerstone for any couple wanting to marry in the church. And this is where we need to talk about Father Richard. He was 62 years old, with silver hair that he wore slightly longer than most clergy, always perfectly styled. He had warm brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled, which was often. His voice was deep and soothing, the kind of voice that commanded attention without ever seeming to demand it. He'd been serving at Cornerstone Community Church for 18 years, arriving in 2001 from a parish in Ohio. In those 18 years, he'd become more than just the church's spiritual leader. He was a counselor, a confidant, a friend to hundreds of families. When marriages struggled, couples sought his advice. When teenagers rebelled, parents brought them to Father Richard. When someone lost a job or faced a health crisis or dealt with addiction, Father Richard was the first call. He had a gift for making people feel heard, for asking the right questions, for offering wisdom that seemed to come from a deep well of compassion and understanding. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that Father Richard had been carefully constructing this persona for decades. The warm smile, the compassionate listening, the trustworthy demeanor, all of it was a mask hiding something much darker. He was a predator, but not the kind you see in movies, not someone obviously creepy or threatening. He was sophisticated, patient, calculating. He understood psychology, understood how to identify vulnerable people, understood how to create situations where he could act without being caught, understood how to manipulate trust and authority to get what he wanted. Father Richard had learned early in his career that clergy occupied a unique position of power. People saw the collar and automatically attributed goodness, morality, trustworthiness. They let their guard down. They shared their secrets, their struggles, their deepest fears. And Father Richard had learned how to weaponize that trust. Over the years, he developed a pattern. He would identify women who were vulnerable in some way, going through a divorce, struggling with depression, dealing with family conflict, anyone whose defenses were down, who was actively seeking guidance and support. He would offer extra counseling sessions, always in private, always in settings where no one else was around. He would blur boundaries slowly, a hand on the shoulder that lingered too long, comments about appearance that were just slightly too personal, questions about intimate details of their lives that seemed inappropriate but could be explained away as pastoral concern. And then, when he'd established enough trust and isolation, he would assault them. Sometimes it happened in his office after hours. Sometimes in their homes during pastoral visits. He was always careful to choose women who would be unlikely to report him, who had too much to lose, who wouldn't be believed, or who were so damaged already that one more violation might not even register. And if anyone did complain, he had a network of protection. The church hierarchy, the denominational leadership, they had their own reasons for keeping things quiet. Scandal was bad for business. Lawsuits were expensive. It was easier to move a problematic priest to a new location, to settle complaints quietly with non-disclosure agreements, to pressure victims into silence by questioning their credibility or their motives. Father Richard had been moved 3 times before arriving at Cornerstone. Each time, there had been whispers, accusations, complaints that were never formally investigated. Each time, the leadership had chosen institutional preservation over victim protection. And each time, Father Richard had learned to be more careful, more sophisticated, more confident that he was untouchable. When Sarah and Michael began their premarital counseling sessions with Father Richard, they had no idea about any of this. To them, he was just the beloved pastor who'd welcomed Michael into the community, who'd known Sarah since she was a child, who'd agreed to officiate their wedding. The counseling sessions took place once a month for 6 months, each meeting lasting about 90 minutes. They covered all the expected topics: communication, conflict resolution, financial planning, sexual intimacy, family dynamics, spiritual practices. Father Richard was good at his job in these settings. He asked probing questions, shared wisdom from his years of experience, offered practical advice. Sarah and Michael found the sessions genuinely helpful. They had conversations they might not have had otherwise, addressed potential issues before they became problems, aligned their expectations about marriage. But looking back later, Sarah would realize that Father Richard had been studying them during these sessions, learning their dynamics, their vulnerabilities, their boundaries. He'd paid particular attention to Sarah, asking her questions about her childhood, her past relationships, her insecurities. At the time, it had seemed like pastoral care, like he was trying to understand her fully to provide better guidance. But he'd been doing something else entirely. He'd been assessing whether she would be a good target. Sarah had several qualities that made her vulnerable in Father Richard's calculus. She was naturally trusting, tended to see the best in people, gave others the benefit of the doubt. She had a people-pleasing tendency, found it hard to say no, especially to authority figures or people she respected. She'd been raised to view clergy as special, as representatives of God who deserved deference and obedience. And she was going through a high-stress time, planning a wedding while working full-time, dealing with family dynamics that were occasionally tense, experiencing normal pre-wedding jitters about such a major life change. Father Richard had also noticed something else: Michael's protective instincts towards Sarah, the way he watched her in conversations, the way he seemed to pick up on her emotional states even when she was hiding them. This presented a challenge but also an opportunity. If Father Richard could find a moment when Michael wasn't around, when Sarah was isolated and vulnerable, he could act. And the wedding day itself presented the perfect opportunity. On a wedding day, everyone is distracted, emotional, scattered across different areas preparing for the ceremony. The bride is typically alone or with bridesmaids at various points, going through the ritualistic preparations that tradition demands. And there's an expectation that the officiant, the person conducting the ceremony, will check in with both bride and groom before everything begins. It would seem completely normal for Father Richard to visit the bridal suite, to offer a prayer or words of encouragement, to ensure Sarah was ready. No one would question it. No one would think twice about it. And that's exactly what he was counting on. As the wedding day approached, Sarah was a bundle of nerves and excitement. She'd taken the week off work to handle last-minute details. There were 1,000 things to coordinate: the florist, the caterer, the photographer, the DJ, seating arrangements, programs, favors, the rehearsal dinner. Her mother was both helpful and stressful, having strong opinions about every detail and occasionally clashing with Sarah's vision. Her sisters were in the wedding party and had their own drama, one going through a messy breakup, the other pregnant and dealing with morning sickness. Michael, bless him, stayed calm through all of it. He showed up when Sarah needed him, gave her space when she needed that, and never complained about the chaos. His main contribution was handling all the logistics for their honeymoon, a 2-week trip to Ireland that Sarah had always dreamed of taking. They'd planned to spend most of their time driving through the countryside, staying in small bed and breakfasts, exploring castles and cliffs and tiny villages where life moved at a different pace. The night before the wedding, following tradition, Sarah and Michael stayed in separate locations. Sarah was at her parents' house with her bridesmaids, trying to sleep but too wired to actually rest. Michael was at his apartment with his groomsmen, having a low-key evening of pizza and card games. They'd agreed not to text or call each other, wanting to save everything for the moment Sarah walked down the aisle. Sarah lay in her childhood bedroom, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars she'd stuck to the ceiling when she was 10, thinking about how her life was about to change. She wasn't scared exactly, but she was aware of the weight of what she was about to do, the commitment she was about to make. Marriage wasn't something she took lightly. It was a promise to show up for someone every day, even on the days when you didn't feel like it, even when things got hard. But as she thought about Michael, about his steadiness and kindness and the way he made her laugh even when she was stressed, she felt certain she was making the right choice. If she could go back to that moment, knowing what was coming, knowing that in less than 24 hours her entire world would shatter, would she have done anything differently? It's a question that would haunt her for years. But the truth is, there was nothing she could have done differently. Nothing she did invited what happened. Nothing she wore or said or didn't say caused it. The responsibility for what was about to occur belonged entirely to one person, Father Richard Chambers. And he'd already made his decision about what he was going to do. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of September day that makes you understand why people choose to get married in the fall. The air was crisp but not cold, the sky a brilliant blue, the trees just beginning to show hints of color at the edges of their leaves. Sarah woke up early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Her bridesmaids were already awake, moving around the house, making coffee, setting out the breakfast spread her mother had prepared the night before. There were bagels and fruit, pastries and yogurt, though Sarah couldn't imagine eating anything substantial. Her stomach was too tight, too full of anticipation. They'd scheduled hair and makeup to start at 9, giving them plenty of time before they needed to be at the church at 11. The wedding wasn't until 2 in the afternoon, but there were photos to take, final preparations to oversee, a million little details that needed attention. Sarah's hairstylist arrived right on time, setting up her tools in the dining room that had been converted into a makeshift salon. One by one, Sarah and her 4 bridesmaids got their hair done, each style slightly different but coordinated. Sarah had chosen a soft updo with loose curls framing her face, elegant but not overly formal. While the stylist worked, the women laughed and told stories, reminiscing about how Sarah and Michael had met, sharing predictions about their future, offering marriage advice both sincere and ridiculous. Sarah's oldest sister, Jennifer, was 32 and had been married for 6 years. She told Sarah that the key to a happy marriage was separate bathrooms and never going to bed angry. Sarah's middle sister, Rachel, was 29 and had been married for 2 years. She said the real key was learning to fight productively, to say what you actually meant instead of expecting your partner to read your mind. Sarah's best friend from college, Amy, had been married and divorced by age 25. Her advice was darker but maybe more honest: never lose yourself in the relationship, never make someone else responsible for your happiness, and always have your own money in case you need to leave. Sarah listened to all of it, filing it away, knowing that every relationship was different and what worked for one couple might not work for another. By 10:30, hair and makeup were done, and it was time to head to the church. Sarah's mother had already gone ahead to oversee setup and make sure everything was progressing according to plan. Sarah and her bridesmaids piled into 2 cars, still in comfortable clothes, carrying the garment bags that held their dresses. The drive to Cornerstone Community Church took 15 minutes through quiet country roads. Sarah looked out the window at familiar landmarks, the farm where they'd bought pumpkins every October, the small cemetery where her grandparents were buried, the elementary school where her mother taught. This was her world, the place she'd always known, and in some ways it would always be home even as she and Michael built their own life together. They arrived at the church to find controlled chaos. The florist was still arranging centerpieces. The caterer was setting up in the fellowship hall where the reception would take place. The photographer was testing lighting in various locations. Sarah's mother was in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing traffic like a general commanding troops. When she saw Sarah arrive, she rushed over, kissing her cheek, telling her she looked beautiful even though her makeup was done but she was still in jeans and a t-shirt. The bridal suite was located in a small wing of the church, a room that was usually used for Sunday school classes but had been cleared out and decorated for the occasion. Someone had brought in a full-length mirror, a clothing rack, a small table with a coffee maker and snacks. There were flowers everywhere, the scent almost overwhelming. Sarah's wedding dress hung on the rack, a simple but elegant A-line gown with lace sleeves and a chapel-length train. She'd found it at a small bridal boutique in town, had known immediately it was the one. It wasn't the most expensive dress she tried on, wasn't the most elaborate, but it felt right, felt like her. Meanwhile, Michael had arrived at the church with his groomsmen, using a different entrance to maintain the tradition of not seeing the bride before the ceremony. Michael's preparation area was actually Father Richard's office, a wood-paneled room lined with bookshelves, dominated by a large desk and comfortable chairs. Michael's groomsmen were his best friend from college, 2 guys he taught with, and his younger cousin. They were all in good spirits, joking around, helping each other with ties and cufflinks. Michael was quieter than usual, which his best friend noted. He asked if Michael was getting cold feet, but Michael shook his head. He said he just wanted everything to be perfect for Sarah, that she'd put so much work into planning this day and he hoped it lived up to her dreams. His best friend clapped him on the shoulder and said that as long as they ended the day married, everything else was just details. Michael smiled at that, but the knot of anxiety in his stomach didn't entirely loosen. He couldn't explain it, couldn't point to anything specific that was wrong, but something felt off. He told himself it was just normal wedding day jitters, the weight of the commitment he was about to make, the significance of the moment. But part of him, the part that had learned to trust his instincts, wondered if it was something more. Back in the bridal suite, Sarah and her bridesmaids were getting into their dresses. There was a lot of laughter, some tears, moments of genuine emotion mixed with practical concerns about zippers and bustles and making sure no one stepped on anyone else's train. Sarah's mother came in to help her into her dress, and the moment got to both of them. Linda Mitchell looked at her youngest daughter and saw both the woman she'd become and the little girl who used to play dress-up in her closet. She told Sarah how proud she was, how much she loved her, how she knew Sarah and Michael were going to build a beautiful life together. Sarah hugged her mother, careful not to mess up either of their makeup, and whispered thank you for everything. By noon, everyone was dressed and the photographer was taking getting-ready photos. Sarah with her bridesmaids, laughing and popping champagne even though it was barely afternoon. Close-ups of the dress, the shoes, the jewelry, the bouquet. Candid shots of the bridesmaids helping Sarah with final touches. These were the photos that would later be almost painful to look at, because everyone in them was so happy, so blissfully unaware of what was about to happen. At 12:15, Sarah's bridesmaids stepped out to take some photos outside and to check on a few last-minute details with the wedding coordinator. They'd be back in 20 minutes, they said. Sarah was left alone in the bridal suite, which was fine with her. She actually welcomed a few moments of quiet, a chance to catch her breath and center herself before the ceremony. She stood in front of the mirror, looking at herself in her wedding dress, still not quite believing this was really happening. She thought about Michael waiting somewhere in this same building, probably nervous, definitely overthinking everything. She smiled at the thought of him. In less than 2 hours, they'd be married. The ceremony would happen, the vows would be spoken, and they'd start their life together. She was so focused on these thoughts, so lost in the moment, that she didn't hear the soft knock on the door at first. When it came again, slightly louder, she called out that it was okay to come in, assuming it was one of her bridesmaids returning or maybe her mother checking on her one more time. The door opened, and Father Richard stepped inside. At first, Sarah's brain didn't register anything wrong. Of course the priest would check in on her before the ceremony. That made perfect sense. He was here to offer a blessing, to make sure she was ready, to provide some final words of wisdom or encouragement. She smiled at him, grateful for his presence, grateful for the months of counseling that had helped her and Michael prepare for this moment. Father Richard smiled back, and his smile was warm and reassuring, exactly what you'd expect from a beloved pastor about to officiate a wedding. But then he closed the door behind him, and Sarah heard the quiet click of the lock engaging. And in that moment, everything changed. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. I know this is heavy, I know it's difficult to hear, but it's important that we don't look away from these stories. They're real, they happen more often than we want to believe, and the only way we create change is by facing uncomfortable truths. So if you're still with us, let us know in the comments. And if this story is resonating with you or bringing up difficult emotions, please take care of yourself. It's okay to pause, to step away if you need to reach out to someone you trust. Now let's continue with what happened next, because as dark as this gets, I promise you there is courage and justice and hope in this story too. The sound of the lock clicking into place sent a jolt of adrenaline through Sarah's body. Her heart rate spiked, her breath caught, and every instinct she had screamed that something was wrong. But her rational mind tried to override those instincts. This was Father Richard. The man who'd counseled her and Michael. The man who'd known her since she was a child. The man her entire community trusted and revered. Surely there was a reasonable explanation for why he'd locked the door. Maybe he wanted to pray with her in private, without any interruptions. Maybe there was something important he needed to discuss before the ceremony. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to calm the panic that was rising in her chest. Father Richard moved closer, and Sarah instinctively took a step back. He noticed, and his expression shifted slightly, the warm smile remaining but something cold entering his eyes. He told her she looked beautiful, that he'd been looking forward to this day. The way he said it made Sarah's skin crawl. There was something in his tone, something proprietary and intimate that crossed every boundary of appropriate pastoral conduct. Sarah tried to speak, to ask him what he needed, to suggest they could talk later after the ceremony, but her voice came out weak and uncertain. Father Richard kept moving toward her, backing her into the corner of the room near the window. He was talking the whole time, saying things that later Sarah wouldn't fully remember because her brain was too focused on survival to process the words. Something about how special she was, how he'd been watching her, how he'd been waiting for the right moment. Sarah's back hit the wall and she had nowhere else to go. She told him to stop, to please leave, that her bridesmaids would be back any minute. But Father Richard just smiled and said they wouldn't be back for a while, that he'd timed this perfectly, that no one would interrupt them. The calculation in his voice, the clear evidence that he'd planned this, made Sarah's blood run cold. She tried to move around him, to get to the door, but he blocked her path. He was bigger than her, stronger, and he used his body to trap her against the wall. Sarah's mind was screaming at her to fight, to scream, to do something, but her body wasn't responding the way she wanted it to. This is something people don't understand about trauma, about assault. We have this idea that victims should fight back, should scream, should resist with everything they have. But the reality is that when you're faced with a threat, especially from someone you trusted, your brain often goes into freeze mode. It's a biological response, not a choice. Your body essentially shuts down as a survival mechanism, and you become disconnected from your physical self, watching what's happening as if from outside your own body. That's what happened to Sarah. As Father Richard put his hands on her, as he began touching her in ways that made her want to vomit, Sarah felt herself split into two people. One part of her was present, feeling everything, experiencing the violation in vivid, horrible detail. The other part floated somewhere above, observing with a strange detachment, cataloging what was happening without emotional response because the emotional response would have been too overwhelming to survive. Sarah tried to push him away, but her arms felt weak, disconnected. She tried to scream, but only a small whimper came out. Father Richard's hand covered her mouth, pressing hard enough to hurt, hard enough to silence any sound she might make. And then he assaulted her. I'm not going to describe the details because Sarah's trauma isn't entertainment and she deserves her privacy even as we tell her story. What you need to know is that it was violent, it was painful, and it lasted several minutes that felt like hours. What you need to know is that throughout it, Father Richard maintained that cold calculation, that sense of entitlement, that absolute confidence that he would get away with this. What you need to know is that Sarah's mind fractured during those minutes, splitting into fragments that would take months of therapy to piece back together. When it was finally over, Father Richard stepped back and straightened his robes as if he'd just finished a normal pastoral duty. He looked at Sarah, crumpled on the floor in her wedding dress, and the expression on his face was almost bored. He told her to clean herself up, to fix her makeup, to walk down that aisle in 30 minutes and marry Michael as if nothing had happened. He said that if she told anyone, no one would believe her. He was a respected clergy member, a pillar of the community, someone who dedicated his life to serving God. She was just a bride who might be having cold feet, who might be looking for attention, who might be confused about what actually happened. He said that speaking up would destroy her wedding, would humiliate her family, would ruin her reputation in this town where everyone knew everyone. He said that it would hurt Michael, would make him question her, would plant seeds of doubt that would poison their marriage before it even began. He said that the best thing she could do, the kindest thing, was to keep this to herself, to let this day continue as planned, to build her life with Michael and forget this ever happened. Then he unlocked the door, checked to make sure no one was in the hallway, and walked out as casually as if he'd just stopped by to say hello. Sarah remained on the floor, her wedding dress pooled around her like a broken dream. She couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't process what had just happened. Her mind kept trying to reject it, to insist that it couldn't be real, that things like this didn't happen, especially not on your wedding day, especially not by a priest, especially not in a church. But her body knew the truth. She could feel it in the pain, in the violation, in the way her skin crawled and her stomach churned. She could feel it in the trembling that she couldn't control, in the tears that started streaming down her face, ruining the makeup that had taken an hour to perfect. Time became meaningless. Sarah didn't know if she sat there for 2 minutes or 20. She was vaguely aware that she needed to do something, needed to get up, needed to figure out what to do next. But every option seemed impossible. She could go ahead with the wedding, pretend nothing happened, smile and say her vows while feeling dead inside. She could cancel everything, tell everyone she'd changed her mind, face the confusion and disappointment without explaining why. She could tell the truth, risk not being believed, watch everything explode. There was no good choice. Every path led to some kind of destruction. Sarah eventually pulled herself to her feet, using the wall for support because her legs were shaking so badly she didn't trust them to hold her. She caught sight of herself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the person looking back. Her makeup was streaked with tears. Her hair had come partially undone. Her eyes had a hollow, haunted look that she'd never seen before. And her dress, the beautiful dress she'd chosen so carefully, felt contaminated now, ruined by association with the worst moment of her life. She thought about Michael, waiting for her, excited to start their life together, completely unaware that everything had just changed. She thought about her parents, so proud and happy, hosting a wedding celebration for 200 guests. She thought about her sisters, her friends, everyone who'd shown up today to witness and celebrate. How could she possibly tell them? How could she possibly not? Sarah was still standing there, frozen in indecision and shock, when she heard voices in the hallway. Her bridesmaids were returning. She could hear them laughing about something, their footsteps approaching the bridal suite. Panic surged through her. She couldn't let them see her like this. She quickly grabbed tissues and tried to fix her face, wiping away the smeared mascara, attempting to restore some sense of normalcy to her appearance. But her hands were shaking so badly she kept making it worse. There was a knock on the door, and Amy's voice called out asking if Sarah was okay. Sarah tried to answer, tried to say she was fine, but what came out was a strangled sob. The door opened immediately, and all 4 bridesmaids rushed in, their faces shifting from joy to concern in an instant. They surrounded Sarah, asking what was wrong, what had happened, why was she crying. Sarah couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. How do you tell people that the priest just assaulted you? How do you say those words out loud and make them real? Her oldest sister, Jennifer, took charge. She sent the other bridesmaids to get water and find Sarah's mother, then sat down with Sarah and held her hands. She spoke in a calm, steady voice, telling Sarah to breathe, to take her time, to tell her what happened when she was ready. But Sarah just kept shaking her head, kept saying she couldn't, she couldn't, she couldn't. Couldn't what? Jennifer asked. Couldn't tell. Couldn't go through with the wedding. Couldn't handle any of this. Yes, Sarah thought. All of it. All of the above. While Sarah was falling apart in the bridal suite, Michael was standing in Father Richard's office, staring at his reflection in the small mirror on the wall and feeling increasingly uneasy. His groomsmen had gone to check on some logistical detail with the DJ, leaving him alone with his thoughts. And his thoughts were not cooperating with the happy wedding day narrative they were supposed to be following. Something felt wrong. Michael couldn't explain it, couldn't point to any concrete evidence, but the feeling had been growing stronger for the past 15 minutes. It was like a low hum of anxiety in his chest, a sense that somewhere in this building, something bad was happening. He checked his watch. 12:30. The ceremony would start in 90 minutes. Everything should be on track, running smoothly, progressing toward that moment when Sarah would walk down the aisle and they'd say their vows. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Michael thought about Sarah, tried to imagine what she was doing right now. Probably laughing with her bridesmaids. Probably taking photos. Probably so happy and beautiful and excited. But even as he pictured this, his instinct whispered that something was wrong. He'd learned to trust that instinct over the years. It had served him well in his teaching career, alerting him when a student was struggling with more than just academics, when a situation was about to escalate, when someone needed help even if they weren't asking for it. Michael had a theory about instinct, that it wasn't some mystical sixth sense but rather your subconscious picking up on subtle cues that your conscious mind hadn't processed yet. A change in someone's voice. A shift in body language. A detail that didn't quite fit the expected pattern. Your brain noticed these things even when you weren't aware of it, and it communicated through that gut feeling, that sense that something was off even when everything seemed fine on the surface. Michael made a decision. He was going to check on Sarah. It went against tradition, sure. The groom wasn't supposed to see the bride before the wedding. But tradition seemed less important than the insistent voice in his head telling him to go, to find her, to make sure she was okay. He left Father Richard's office and started walking through the church, navigating the hallways he'd come to know over the past 3 years. He passed the sanctuary where guests were already starting to arrive, taking their seats, admiring the floral arrangements. He nodded at a few people who greeted him, but he didn't stop to chat. He kept moving, following the route he knew would take him to the bridal suite. As he got closer, his unease intensified. He couldn't explain why. There was nothing obviously wrong. No sounds of distress. No visible signs of trouble. Just that persistent feeling that something had happened, was happening, needed his attention. Michael reached the hallway that led to the bridal suite and saw Father Richard walking toward him from the opposite direction. The priest smiled when he saw Michael, that warm pastoral smile that everyone in the congregation knew and trusted. He greeted Michael, asked how he was feeling, made a joke about wedding day jitters. Michael responded automatically, going through the motions of polite conversation, but he was studying Father Richard's face, his body language, looking for something without knowing what. There was something in the priest's eyes, Michael thought. Something that didn't match the warmth of his smile. A coldness, a calculation, a satisfaction that seemed out of place. Or maybe Michael was imagining it, projecting his own anxiety onto a perfectly normal interaction. Father Richard walked past him, heading back toward his office, and Michael continued toward the bridal suite. The door was closed, and he could hear voices inside. Female voices, multiple people talking at once, the tone urgent and concerned. Michael's heart rate spiked. That was not the sound of happy pre-wedding preparation. That was the sound of something wrong. He knocked on the door, calling out Sarah's name. The voices inside went quiet for a moment, and then he heard footsteps approaching. The door opened a crack, and Sarah's sister Jennifer looked out at him. Her face was pale, her expression worried. She told him he couldn't come in, that it was bad luck to see the bride, but Michael could hear the strain in her voice. He asked if Sarah was okay, and Jennifer hesitated just a fraction of a second too long before saying yes. That hesitation told Michael everything he needed to know. He pushed the door open gently but firmly, not barging in but making it clear he wasn't leaving without seeing Sarah. Jennifer tried to stop him, but her heart wasn't in it. She stepped aside, and Michael entered the bridal suite. What he saw made his blood run cold. Sarah was sitting in a chair by the window, still in her wedding dress, but something was terribly wrong. Her face was blotchy from crying, her makeup smeared despite obvious attempts to fix it. Her hands were trembling in her lap. Her eyes, when they met his, were empty in a way that terrified him. This wasn't pre-wedding jitters. This wasn't nerves or second thoughts. This was trauma. Michael had seen this look before, in a student who'd been assaulted at a party, in a colleague who'd survived a violent mugging. This was the look of someone whose world had just shattered. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt in front of Sarah's chair, taking her cold hands in his. He spoke her name softly, asking her what happened, telling her it was okay, she was safe, he was here. Sarah looked at him, and tears started streaming down her face again. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged except small, broken sobs. Michael looked up at Jennifer, at the other bridesmaids who were hovering nearby, their faces pale and frightened. He asked them what happened, but they all shook their heads. Sarah hadn't told them. She'd just been like this when they returned to the room, and she wouldn't or couldn't explain what was wrong. Michael turned back to Sarah, still holding her hands, still speaking in that calm, steady voice that he used with his students when they were upset. He told her she didn't have to say anything if she wasn't ready. He told her that whatever happened, they would deal with it together. He told her that nothing was more important than her well-being, not the wedding, not the guests, not the money they'd spent or the plans they'd made. If she needed to cancel everything and walk out of this church right now, they would do that. If she needed to talk to someone, they would find someone. If she needed time, they would take time. Whatever she needed, he would make it happen. Sarah's hands tightened around his, gripping so hard it hurt. She was looking at him with an expression that broke his heart, a mixture of love and gratitude and absolute devastation. She opened her mouth again, and this time, words came out, barely a whisper, so quiet Michael had to lean in to hear. "Father Richard," she said. Just those 2 words. But they were enough. Michael felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. The implications of those two words, spoken in that broken tone, in this context, were immediately clear. He didn't need her to explain further. He understood. And in that moment of understanding, rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced flooded through him. His hands, still holding Sarah's, began to shake. His vision narrowed. Every muscle in his body tensed, preparing for violence. He wanted to find Father Richard and hurt him, wanted to make him pay for whatever he'd done to Sarah, wanted to destroy him. But Sarah was still holding his hands, still looking at him with those devastated eyes, and Michael realized that giving in to his rage right now would not help her. She needed him to be calm, to be present, to be the steady person she could lean on. So he took a breath, deep and slow, forcing the rage down, not eliminating it but controlling it, channeling it into something more useful than blind fury. He asked Sarah, very gently, if Father Richard had hurt her. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. He asked if it had happened here, in this room. Another nod. He asked when. She whispered that it had been maybe 20 minutes ago, maybe less. Time was strange and she couldn't quite track it. 20 minutes. Michael's mind reeled. 20 minutes ago, he'd been in Father Richard's office, getting ready for his wedding, completely unaware that in another part of this building, the woman he loved was being assaulted by the man they trusted to officiate their marriage. 20 minutes ago, while he'd been joking with his groomsmen and adjusting his tie, Sarah's world had been falling apart. The guilt hit him like a wave, irrational but overwhelming. How had he not known? How had he not felt it? Why hadn't he trusted his instincts sooner? But he pushed the guilt aside because it wasn't helpful right now. Right now, Sarah needed him to act, to make decisions, to help her navigate this nightmare. Michael pulled out his phone and called his sister, Jessica, who was a social worker specializing in trauma and assault cases. She answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful, expecting a happy call from her brother on his wedding day. Michael cut through the pleasantries and explained the situation in quick, quiet sentences. He watched Jessica's tone change immediately from cheerful to professional. She told him not to let Sarah shower or change clothes, that there might be physical evidence that needed to be preserved. She told him to call the police immediately, that this was a crime and needed to be reported. She told him that Sarah might resist, might want to just pretend it never happened, but that reporting was crucial not just for her own healing but to prevent Father Richard from doing this to someone else. Michael relayed this information to Sarah, whose face went even paler if that was possible. She started shaking her head, saying she couldn't tell the police, couldn't let everyone know, couldn't destroy the wedding, couldn't face the questions and the judgment and the public exposure of her most private trauma. Michael understood her fear. He understood why reporting seemed impossible, why silence seemed safer. But he also knew, from watching his sister work with assault survivors over the years, that silence protected perpetrators while exposure protected potential future victims. He tried to explain this to Sarah, tried to help her see beyond her immediate fear to the bigger picture. But Sarah kept shaking her head, kept saying no, kept insisting she just wanted to disappear. That's when Jennifer spoke up. She'd been standing to the side, watching this exchange, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. She knelt down next to Michael and looked directly at her younger sister. She told Sarah that she loved her, that she believed her, that she would support whatever decision she made. But she also said that if Father Richard had done this to Sarah, he'd almost certainly done it to others. And if they didn't stop him now, he would do it again. Some other woman, maybe younger, maybe even more vulnerable than Sarah, would become his next victim. Could Sarah live with that? Could she spend the rest of her life wondering if her silence had enabled more assaults? It was a harsh thing to say, putting that weight on Sarah when she was already drowning. But Jennifer knew her sister, knew that Sarah's deepest values centered around protecting others, around preventing harm, around using her own experiences to help people. And she was right. Something shifted in Sarah's expression. The terror didn't leave, but it was joined by something else, a determination, a sense of purpose. She looked at Michael and asked what they needed to do. Michael called 911. His voice was steady as he explained to the dispatcher that he needed to report a sexual assault that had occurred approximately 30 minutes ago at Cornerstone Community Church. He provided the address, confirmed that the victim was safe and with family, requested that female officers be sent if possible. The dispatcher assured him that officers were being dispatched immediately and would arrive within 10 minutes. She asked if the perpetrator was still on the premises. Michael said yes, that he believed the perpetrator was Father Richard Chambers, the priest who was supposed to officiate the wedding. There was a brief pause on the line, and Michael could practically hear the dispatcher's surprise, but to her credit, she remained professional and simply confirmed the information. After hanging up with 911, Michael made the hardest call of his life. He phoned his best man and told him that the wedding was being postponed, that there was a family emergency, that guests needed to be informed and asked to leave quietly and respectfully. His best man started asking questions, but Michael cut him off. He said he couldn't explain right now, that he just needed this handled. His best man, hearing the steel in Michael's voice, agreed immediately and said he'd take care of it. Within minutes, word began spreading through the church that the wedding was postponed. Guests who'd been settling into their seats were now being ushered out, confused and concerned. Some were annoyed, having taken time off work and traveled to be here. Others were worried, sensing that something serious had happened. Speculation ran wild. Was the bride sick? Had someone died? Had someone objected to the marriage? Sarah's mother, Linda, who'd been in the sanctuary greeting guests, heard the commotion and immediately headed toward the bridal suite. She arrived just as Michael was getting off the phone, and she took one look at her daughter's face and knew that something terrible had happened. She rushed to Sarah, enveloping her in a hug, asking what was wrong, what could she do. When Sarah whispered what had happened, Linda's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, understanding, horror, and finally, rage. She started to stand, started to say she was going to find Father Richard herself, but Michael gently pulled her back. He told her the police were coming, that they needed to let the authorities handle this, that Sarah needed her mother right now more than anything else. Linda nodded, but her hands were shaking with the effort of controlling her fury. She held Sarah close, whispering apologies though none of this was her fault, promising that they would get through this, that Sarah wasn't alone. 2 police officers arrived at the church within 12 minutes of Michael's call. Officer Martinez, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, and Officer Chen, a younger male officer who looked serious and focused. Michael met them at the entrance and led them to the bridal suite, briefly explaining the situation as they walked. Officer Martinez asked if Sarah had been seen by a doctor yet, and Michael said no, that this had happened less than an hour ago. Officer Martinez nodded and radioed for a sexual assault nurse examiner to meet them at the hospital. When they entered the bridal suite, Officer Martinez approached Sarah slowly, introducing herself, asking permission to sit down and talk. Her voice was gentle but professional, striking a balance between compassion and efficiency. She explained that she knew this was difficult, that she understood Sarah might not want to talk about what happened, but that reporting was important both for Sarah's sake and to prevent future assaults. Sarah, with Michael holding one hand and her mother holding the other, began to tell her story. It came out haltingly, in fragments, sometimes chronologically and sometimes jumping around as memories surfaced in the order that trauma allowed rather than the order they'd occurred. Officer Martinez listened without interrupting, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just letting Sarah speak at her own pace. She asked if Father Richard had said anything that might indicate this was planned, and Sarah remembered his comment about timing it perfectly, about knowing her bridesmaids wouldn't be back. She asked if there had been any physical injuries beyond the assault itself, and Sarah said she didn't know, she hadn't really examined herself, the thought of looking made her feel sick. Officer Martinez explained that a sexual assault nurse examiner, called a sane nurse, would conduct a medical examination and collect any physical evidence. She said it would be invasive and uncomfortable, but it was important to do it as soon as possible. Evidence deteriorated quickly, and having solid physical evidence could make the difference between a conviction and an acquittal. While Officer Martinez was talking with Sarah, Officer Chen stepped outside to radio for additional units. They needed to locate Father Richard and bring him in for questioning. Chen also contacted his supervisor to explain the sensitive nature of the case, a religious leader accused of assaulting a bride on her wedding day. This was going to be high profile, was going to attract media attention, was going to require careful handling. Within 20 minutes, 2 more police cars arrived at the church. The remaining guests had cleared out by this point, but several family members and close friends had refused to leave, sensing that something serious was happening and wanting to be available if Sarah or Michael needed support. Officers began searching the church for Father Richard. They found him in the sanctuary, of all places, adjusting floral arrangements as if preparing for a ceremony that was no longer going to happen. When Officer Chen approached and informed him that there had been an accusation of sexual assault and that he needed to come to the station for questioning, Father Richard's reaction was chillingly calm. He expressed surprise, asked who was making such an accusation, but his tone was more curious than concerned. When Chen told him it was the bride, Father Richard's expression flickered for just a moment, something cold and calculating crossing his features before the mask of confused concern returned. He said he'd be happy to clear up any misunderstanding, that he couldn't imagine what Sarah might be referring to, that perhaps the stress of the wedding day had caused some kind of confusion. His willingness to cooperate, his calm demeanor, his reasonable tone, all of it was designed to make him appear innocent, to make the officers question whether this accusation could possibly be true. But Officer Chen had been doing this job long enough to know that predators often presented well, that some of the worst criminals he'd encountered had been charming and cooperative right up until the evidence became overwhelming. Father Richard was informed that he wasn't under arrest at this point but that he needed to come to the station to answer some questions. He agreed readily, asking if he could stop by his office first to get his coat. Chen accompanied him, watching as Father Richard moved around the office, noting how comfortable he seemed, how unconcerned. Most innocent people, when accused of something as serious as sexual assault, showed distress, anxiety, fear about the accusation and its implications for their reputation. Father Richard showed none of that. He chatted pleasantly with Officer Chen as they walked to the police car, even waved at a few church members who were standing in the parking lot, confused about why the police were there. At the hospital, Sarah was taken to a private examination room where a sane nurse named Patricia was waiting. Patricia was in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and a face that radiated both competence and compassion. She explained to Sarah exactly what the examination would involve, step by step, giving Sarah control wherever possible, asking permission before each phase of the exam. The process took nearly 2 hours and was, as Officer Martinez had warned, invasive and uncomfortable. Sarah cried through most of it, but Michael and her mother were allowed to stay in the room, standing where Sarah could see them, providing silent support. Patricia collected physical evidence, took photographs of injuries, conducted a full medical examination. She explained everything she was doing and why, treating Sarah with a gentleness that made the ordeal slightly more bearable. When it was over, Patricia told Sarah that she'd done incredibly well, that she knew how difficult this was, that the evidence she'd been able to collect would be crucial in building a case. She gave Sarah information about follow-up care, about counseling services, about support groups for assault survivors. She told Sarah that what happened wasn't her fault, that nothing she did or didn't do caused this, that the responsibility belonged entirely to her assailant. Back at the police station, Father Richard was sitting in an interview room, still appearing calm and cooperative. Detectives Miller and Rodriguez entered and began the interview. They started with basic questions: his relationship with Sarah, his role in the wedding planning, his activities that morning. Father Richard answered everything smoothly, explaining that he'd been the couple's premarital counselor, that he'd known Sarah since she was young, that he considered both her and Michael friends as well as congregants. When they asked about visiting the bridal suite, Father Richard didn't deny it. He said yes, he'd stopped by to check on Sarah and offer a prayer before the ceremony. It was something he did for all his brides, a little tradition. He'd been there for maybe 5 minutes, had blessed her, had wished her well, and then had left to check on the groom. The detectives asked what time this visit had occurred, and Father Richard said he thought it was around 12:15, though he hadn't checked his watch so he couldn't be certain. They asked if anyone else was present during this visit, and Father Richard said no, Sarah had been alone, which was why he thought it was a good time to offer that private blessing. They asked if anything unusual had happened during this visit, and Father Richard said absolutely not. It had been a perfectly normal, pastoral interaction. He expressed concern about Sarah, said he hoped she was all right, wondered if perhaps the stress of the wedding had caused some kind of breakdown. He'd seen it before, he said, brides overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were about to commit to, sometimes their minds played tricks on them. The detectives listened to all of this with neutral expressions, not revealing what they were thinking. They asked Father Richard if he'd be willing to provide a DNA sample, explained that it was standard procedure in sexual assault investigations, that it would help eliminate him as a suspect. Father Richard hesitated for the first time, and both detectives noticed. But then he agreed, saying he had nothing to hide, that he wanted to clear his name. After the interview, Detectives Miller and Rodriguez stepped out to confer. On the surface, Father Richard had presented well, had been cooperative, had an explanation for being in the bridal suite that wasn't inherently suspicious. A defense attorney would have a lot to work with. But both detectives had noticed small things, the hesitation before agreeing to DNA, the slightly too smooth explanations, the lack of emotional response appropriate to being accused of something so serious, the subtle attempt to undermine Sarah's credibility by suggesting she might be confused or having a breakdown. They'd seen this pattern before with sophisticated predators, people who'd learned how to manipulate systems, who understood that appearing cooperative and reasonable could be as effective as outright denying involvement. Rodriguez suggested they start digging into Father Richard's background, his previous assignments, any complaints or allegations that might have been filed. Miller agreed and also suggested they reach out to the diocese to see if there was any history they should know about. What they found would shock everyone and transform this from a he-said-she-said case into something much bigger. Sarah, Michael, and Sarah's family returned home late that evening, exhausted and traumatized. The house that should have been empty because Sarah and Michael should have been at their wedding reception was instead full of family members who'd refused to leave Sarah alone. Her sisters, her parents, Michael's mother who'd driven in from Pittsburgh the moment she heard what happened, several close friends who'd been at the church and had pieced together enough to understand something terrible had occurred. No one quite knew what to say. How do you comfort someone on what should have been the happiest day of their life when instead it became one of the worst? People brought food that no one ate. They made tea that went cold. They sat in the living room in near silence, the only sound occasional crying or murmured conversations. Sarah sat curled on the couch, still in sweatpants and a t-shirt she'd changed into at the hospital, Michael beside her, his arm around her shoulders. She felt hollow, emptied out, as if the assault had scooped out everything inside her and left only a shell. Michael was struggling with his own emotions. Rage at Father Richard. Guilt that he hadn't protected Sarah, even though rationally he knew he couldn't have prevented what happened. Fear about what this meant for their future, for Sarah's healing, for their relationship. Love for Sarah that was so intense it physically hurt. And underneath all of it, a cold determination that Father Richard would be held accountable, that justice would be served, that this wouldn't be another case where a predator walked free because of his position and power. Around midnight, most people had finally gone home, leaving just Sarah, Michael, and Sarah's parents. Linda made up the guest room for Michael, assuming Sarah would want her childhood room to herself, but Sarah asked Michael to stay with her. She said she couldn't be alone, that she needed him close, that his presence was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. So they lay in Sarah's childhood bed, in the room where she'd dreamed about her future as a little girl, where posters of boy bands and photos from high school still decorated the walls, and they didn't sleep. They just held each other while Sarah cried and Michael whispered that he loved her, that they would get through this, that she was the strongest person he knew even if she didn't feel strong right now. At one point, Sarah asked Michael if he still wanted to marry her. The question broke his heart. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, to make sure she could see his eyes and know he meant every word he was about to say. He told her that what happened didn't change how he felt about her, didn't make him question their relationship, didn't make her less beautiful or less worthy or less anything. He said that if anything, the way she'd found the courage to report what happened, to speak truth even though it was terrifying, made him love and admire her even more. He said that he absolutely still wanted to marry her, whenever she was ready, however she wanted to do it, but only if that was what she wanted too. Sarah cried harder and said yes, she still wanted to marry him, but she didn't know how to move forward from this, didn't know how to build a life when she felt so broken. The next morning, Sunday, brought news that would change everything. Detective Rodriguez had spent Saturday evening and early Sunday morning digging into Father Richard Chambers' background, and what she'd uncovered was damning. Father Richard had been assigned to 5 different parishes over the course of his 30-year career. That in itself wasn't unusual, priests were often transferred for various legitimate reasons. But the pattern of his transfers was suspicious. He'd never stayed anywhere longer than 7 years, and each transfer had occurred relatively abruptly, without the usual advance planning. Rodriguez contacted the diocese that oversaw Father Richard's assignments and spoke with a church administrator who was initially reluctant to share information. But when Rodriguez explained that this was a criminal investigation into sexual assault, the administrator's tone changed. There had been complaints, the administrator admitted. Over the years, 3 different women from 3 different parishes had come forward with allegations against Father Richard. The details were disturbingly similar to Sarah's account: private counseling sessions where boundaries were crossed, assault during moments when the women were isolated and vulnerable, threats that they wouldn't be believed if they reported, pressure to remain silent to protect the church's reputation. In each case, the diocese had investigated internally, which really meant they'd asked Father Richard if the allegations were true and accepted his denials. They'd then approached the women with settlement offers, financial compensation in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements and agreeing not to pursue criminal charges or go public with their stories. 2 of the 3 women had accepted, desperate for validation and support after their reports were initially met with skepticism, worn down by the process, convinced that fighting would be futile. The 3rd woman had refused the settlement and gone to the police, but the case had been dropped due to lack of physical evidence and the he-said-she-said nature of the allegation. In all 3 cases, Father Richard had been quietly moved to a new parish, the allegations had been swept under the rug, and the women had been left to deal with their trauma largely alone. The diocese had prioritized protecting the institution over protecting potential future victims. They'd chosen reputation management over accountability. And in doing so, they'd enabled Father Richard to continue his pattern of abuse for 3 more decades. Rodriguez was furious as she read through the files. This was exactly the kind of institutional failure that allowed predators to operate with impunity. If the first woman's complaint had been properly investigated, if Father Richard had been removed from ministry and reported to law enforcement, Sarah and who knows how many other women would have been protected. But instead, the system had protected the predator and sacrificed the victims. She immediately began trying to locate the 3 women who'd previously accused Father Richard. The 2 who'd signed NDAs were harder to find, as part of their settlements had involved relocating to different areas. But the 3rd woman, Maria Gonzalez, was still living in Ohio, and Rodriguez was able to reach her by phone Sunday morning. Maria was 43 years old now. The assault by Father Richard had happened when she was 26, newly married, seeking counseling because she was struggling with depression after a miscarriage. Father Richard had been her parish priest, someone she'd trusted completely. He'd offered private counseling sessions, had seemed so understanding and supportive. And then one evening, during a session in his office, he'd assaulted her. Maria had reported it immediately to both church authorities and the police. But the church had questioned her account, had suggested she might be misremembering or misinterpreting Father Richard's pastoral care. The police investigation had stalled when no physical evidence could be found and Father Richard had several character witnesses who swore he would never do such a thing. Eventually, the district attorney had declined to prosecute, saying the case was too weak to bring to trial. The experience had devastated Maria. Not just the assault itself, but the aftermath. The disbelief. The subtle victim blaming. The whispered speculation about her motives. The way her own church community had largely rallied around Father Richard rather than supporting her. She'd left the church, left the faith entirely, moved to a different town to escape the constant reminders. And she'd carried the weight of it alone for 17 years. When Detective Rodriguez called and told her there was a new allegation against Father Richard, Maria started crying. She told Rodriguez she'd known he would do it again, had known her report hadn't been enough to stop him, had carried guilt all these years wondering how many other women had been hurt because her case hadn't resulted in consequences. Rodriguez assured Maria that none of this was her fault, that the system had failed her, that she'd done everything right by reporting. She asked if Maria would be willing to testify if the case against Father Richard went to trial. Maria said yes without hesitation. She said she'd do whatever it took to make sure he was finally held accountable. Rodriguez then managed to track down one of the women who'd signed an NDA, a woman named Jessica Torres who was now living in Florida. Jessica was initially reluctant to talk, worried about violating her non-disclosure agreement and the legal consequences that might follow. But Rodriguez explained that NDAs couldn't be used to cover up crimes, that Jessica had every legal right to speak to law enforcement about what had happened to her. Slowly, carefully, Jessica told her story. She'd been 19, a college student home for the summer, when Father Richard had assaulted her during what was supposed to be a spiritual counseling session. She'd told her parents, who'd gone to the diocese. The church had offered $50,000 in settlement, which to Jessica's working-class family had seemed like an enormous amount of money. They'd encouraged her to take it, to put the whole thing behind her, to move on with her life. So she had, or at least she tried to. But moving on was impossible when the trauma lived in her body, in her nightmares, in her difficulty trusting anyone, in her complicated relationship with faith and spirituality. Jessica said she'd be willing to testify too, despite the NDA, despite the fear of legal repercussions. She said that if her testimony could help convict Father Richard, it would be worth any consequences. By Sunday afternoon, Detective Rodriguez had compiled a file that painted a clear picture. Father Richard Chambers was a serial predator who'd been assaulting women for at least 30 years, possibly longer. The pattern was consistent. The victims were all women seeking pastoral care during vulnerable times in their lives. The assaults always occurred in private settings where Father Richard had engineered isolation. And the aftermath always involved him leveraging his authority and the institutional power of the church to avoid consequences. Rodriguez shared all of this with Detective Miller and their supervisor, Lieutenant Hayes. They agreed that they had enough to arrest Father Richard and charge him with sexual assault. But they wanted to do one more thing first, search Father Richard's office and residence to see if there was any additional evidence. They obtained search warrants and executed them Sunday evening. What they found in Father Richard's office would break the case wide open. Hidden behind a row of books on a shelf was a small camera, disguised to look like a book spine. When forensic technicians examined it, they discovered it was motion-activated and had been recording for years. The memory card contained hundreds of hours of footage from Father Richard's office. Much of it was mundane, normal pastoral counseling sessions, meetings, administrative work. But interspersed throughout were recordings of assaults. Father Richard had been documenting his crimes, apparently for his own gratification, never imagining that this evidence would someday be used against him. The detectives watched some of the footage and had to take breaks, it was that disturbing. They saw Father Richard with different women, using the same tactics, the same manipulation, the same pattern of behavior. And they saw Sarah. The date stamp on the video file showed it was from the day before the wedding, but when they watched it, they realized their initial understanding was wrong. This wasn't from a counseling session. This was from the assault on the wedding day itself. Father Richard had apparently brought the small camera with him to the bridal suite, had set it up to capture what he was about to do. The video showed everything. It showed Father Richard entering the bridal suite and locking the door. It showed Sarah's initial confusion and then growing fear. It showed her trying to back away, trying to protest, trying to fight back even though her body was in freeze mode. It showed the assault in graphic, undeniable detail. And perhaps most damningly, it showed Father Richard's complete lack of remorse, his calculated behavior, his threats to Sarah afterward. This was no longer a he said she said case. This was a case with video evidence showing exactly what had happened. Father Richard's defense attorney, when eventually shown this evidence, would try to have it suppressed, arguing it had been obtained through an illegal search. But the judge would rule that the search warrant had been properly obtained based on probable cause, and that even if there were technical issues with the search, Father Richard himself had created the recording, eliminating any expectation of privacy for his own criminal acts. The footage was admissible. When Detective Rodriguez called Sarah on Monday morning to inform her about the video evidence, Sarah had a complex reaction. Part of her was horrified that her assault had been recorded, that this intimate trauma had been captured on video for Father Richard's sick gratification and would now potentially be viewed by police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, possibly a jury. The thought made her feel violated all over again. But another part of her felt a strange sense of relief. She wouldn't have to convince anyone that the assault had happened. She wouldn't have to defend her account against Father Richard's denials. The truth was documented, undeniable, impossible to explain away or minimize. No one could say she'd misunderstood the situation or that her memory was unreliable or that she was lying for attention or revenge. Rodriguez assured Sarah that the video would be handled with the utmost sensitivity, that only people who absolutely needed to see it would have access, that in court it could potentially be described rather than shown if Sarah's attorney argued successfully for that approach. The existence of the video also opened up another avenue of investigation. If Father Richard had assaulted other women in his office where the hidden camera was located, there might be footage of those assaults too. Forensic technicians worked through the hundreds of hours of recordings, and they found footage of 3 other assaults, women who had never reported what happened to them, who had carried the trauma in silence. Detectives began the difficult task of identifying these women and reaching out to them. 2 of them, when contacted, confirmed that they'd been assaulted by Father Richard years ago but had never told anyone, had tried to bury the memories and move forward with their lives. The 3rd woman had moved out of state and couldn't initially be located. Both women who were contacted said they would participate in the prosecution however they could, though the trauma of revisiting what had happened was clearly immense. By Tuesday, Father Richard was formally arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault spanning different years and different victims. The local news covered the story extensively. A beloved priest, a pillar of the community, arrested for serial sexual assault. It was the kind of story that generated intense public interest and debate. Some people immediately believed the victims, were horrified by the allegations, demanded accountability. Others rushed to Father Richard's defense, insisting there must be some mistake, that the man they knew couldn't possibly have done these things, that the accusers must have ulterior motives. This reaction, the automatic defense of the accused and suspicion of the accusers, was part of why sexual assault is so underreported. Victims know they'll face skepticism, judgment, invasive questions about their behavior and motives. They know their trauma will be picked apart and their credibility questioned. But Sarah had decided she wasn't going to hide. When a local reporter reached out requesting an interview, Sarah's first instinct was to say no, to protect her privacy, to avoid putting herself at the center of a media circus. But Michael reminded her of what she'd said in those first terrible hours after the assault, that if speaking up could help even one other person, it would be worth it. So Sarah agreed to an interview, on the condition that she could review and approve anything before it was published. The interview ran in the local paper on Wednesday, with a follow-up television interview airing that evening. Sarah told her story clearly and courageously. She explained what had happened, why she'd chosen to report it, what the process had been like. She talked about the video evidence, about the other victims who'd come forward, about the institutional failures that had allowed Father Richard to continue assaulting women for decades. She made it clear that this wasn't just about one bad priest, it was about systems that protected predators at the expense of victims, about cultures of silence that valued reputation over safety, about the importance of believing survivors and holding people accountable regardless of their position or power. The response to the interview was overwhelming. Sarah's phone and email were flooded with messages. Many were supportive, people thanking her for her courage, sharing their own stories of assault and trauma, expressing solidarity and hope. But some were hostile, accusing her of trying to destroy a good man's reputation, questioning why she hadn't fought back harder, suggesting she had ulterior motives, even claiming she'd somehow seduced Father Richard and was now regretting it. The hostile messages were painful, but Sarah had expected them. Michael helped her set up filters so she didn't have to see the worst of it, and her support system rallied around her, reminding her that the people who lashed out at survivors often did so because believing survivors would require them to confront uncomfortable truths about people they trusted and systems they believed in. It was easier to blame the victim than to acknowledge that someone they'd known and respected for years was a predator. The interview also prompted 3 more women to come forward with their own stories of being assaulted by Father Richard. These women had never reported because they'd assumed no one would believe them, because they'd been young and scared, because they'd blamed themselves, because they'd seen how other accusers were treated and didn't want to face that scrutiny. But seeing Sarah speak publicly, seeing that there was video evidence, seeing that Father Richard was actually being held accountable, gave them the courage to finally tell their truth. With each new victim who came forward, the case against Father Richard became stronger. This wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. This was a decades-long pattern of predatory behavior. The prosecution began building a comprehensive case that would present all of this evidence, would show the jury exactly who Father Richard Chambers really was beneath the pastoral facade. Father Richard's defense attorney tried multiple strategies. He attempted to get the video evidence suppressed, arguing various legal technicalities. When that failed, he tried to argue that the assaults were consensual encounters that the women had later regretted and reframed as assaults. But that argument fell apart when confronted with the video footage showing women clearly in distress, clearly not consenting, clearly being overpowered and violated. The attorney then tried to argue that Father Richard had a mental illness that diminished his responsibility for his actions. But court-appointed psychiatrists who evaluated Father Richard found him to be fully competent, fully aware of right and wrong, and exhibiting traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder and sexual sadism, not conditions that eliminated criminal responsibility but rather ones that made him more dangerous. As the trial date approached, the diocese that had employed Father Richard faced its own reckoning. Several victims filed civil lawsuits against the church, arguing that the institution had been negligent in its hiring, supervision, and retention of Father Richard, and that its policy of quietly settling complaints and moving accused priests had directly enabled the abuse to continue. The lawsuits sought not just financial compensation but also systemic changes to how the diocese handled abuse allegations. Internal church documents obtained during the discovery process revealed just how much church leadership had known about Father Richard and how deliberately they'd chosen to protect him rather than potential victims. There were memos discussing his problematic behaviors, emails debating whether to move him again or finally remove him from ministry, meeting notes where officials worried more about public relations and legal liability than about the women he'd harmed. The public outrage over these revelations was intense. Protesters gathered outside the diocese headquarters demanding the resignation of church officials who'd been involved in covering up abuse. Local media ran investigative pieces examining the broader problem of institutional protection of abusers in religious organizations. And survivors from other churches, other denominations, other contexts altogether, began speaking up about their own experiences, creating a wave of disclosure that forced uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Father Richard's trial began 6 months after Sarah's wedding day that never was. 6 months during which Sarah had gone through intensive therapy, had good days and terrible days, had slowly begun to rebuild her sense of safety and self. 6 months during which Michael had proven over and over that he was in this for the long haul, that his commitment to Sarah wasn't conditional on her being okay or healed or easy to be with. 6 months during which the other victims had found each other, had formed a support network, had prepared themselves to face their abuser in court. The prosecution's strategy was to present a comprehensive picture of Father Richard as a serial predator. They would introduce evidence from multiple victims showing a consistent pattern of behavior. They would present the video evidence, though with sensitivity to the victim's trauma. They would call expert witnesses to explain predator behavior, grooming tactics, and the psychological dynamics that made it difficult for victims to report or resist. And they would methodically dismantle any defense argument that tried to blame the victims or minimize Father Richard's culpability. Sarah was scheduled to testify on the third day of the trial. The 2 days leading up to it were excruciating. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except the looming moment when she'd have to sit in that courtroom, look at Father Richard, and recount the worst day of her life while he stared at her and his attorney tried to tear apart her credibility. Michael took time off work to be with her. Her family surrounded her with support. Her therapist helped her prepare, walking through what to expect, coaching her on how to stay grounded if she started to dissociate, reminding her that telling the truth was enough, that she didn't have to perform or convince anyone, that the evidence would speak for itself. The morning Sarah was scheduled to testify, she woke up at 5 a.m. shaking. Michael held her, neither of them speaking, just breathing together until her body calmed. She got dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that felt strong but not aggressive, professional but not formal. Her mother had wanted to come to the courthouse, but Sarah had asked her not to. She said having her mother in the courtroom while she described the assault would make it harder, would trigger her protective instincts toward her mother's pain rather than allowing her to focus on her own testimony. So it was just Michael who accompanied Sarah to the courthouse, his hand steady in hers as they walked through a gauntlet of media cameras and reporters shouting questions. Inside, the prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in sexual assault cases, met with Sarah one final time to review her testimony. Walsh was in her 50s, had been doing this work for 25 years, and had a reputation for being tough, strategic, and deeply committed to survivor justice. She told Sarah that she was going to be an excellent witness, that her honesty and clarity would be powerful, that the jury would see her courage and respond to it. When Sarah was called to the stand, she walked to the witness box on legs that felt unstable, like they might give out at any moment. She was sworn in, her hand on the Bible feeling surreal given the context, given that the man who'd assaulted her had been a religious leader who'd used that same Bible to justify his authority. Sarah sat down and looked out at the courtroom. The jury, 12 faces watching her with varying expressions of attention and sympathy. The judge, an older man with a stern but not unkind face. The prosecutor, Walsh, giving her an encouraging nod. Michael, sitting in the front row of the gallery, his eyes locked on hers, conveying love and support. And Father Richard, sitting at the defense table in a suit rather than clerical robes, looking older and smaller than Sarah remembered, his expression carefully neutral. Walsh began the direct examination gently, establishing Sarah's background, her relationship with Father Richard, the context of the wedding planning. Then she moved into the events of the wedding day itself, asking Sarah to describe what had happened in the bridal suite. Sarah's voice was steady as she began, though quiet. She described hearing the lock click, feeling fear rising, Father Richard's approach, her attempts to back away. As she got to the actual assault, her voice began to shake, but she pushed through, describing what he'd done, what he'd said, how her body had frozen even as her mind screamed at her to fight. Walsh asked careful questions, helping Sarah through the hardest parts, giving her time when she needed to pause and collect herself. The jury was completely silent, absorbed in Sarah's testimony, several of them visibly emotional. When Walsh asked how the assault had affected Sarah's life, Sarah spoke about the aftermath, the trauma, the nightmares, the difficulty trusting anyone, the way her wedding day had been transformed from what should have been a joyous celebration into a memory of violation and betrayal. She spoke about the therapy, the slow work of healing, the determination not to let Father Richard's actions define her future. Walsh's final question was simple, Sarah, looking back, is there anything you wish you'd done differently that day? Sarah thought about this for a moment, then said, I wish I'd screamed. I wish I'd fought harder. I wish my body had cooperated with what my mind was telling it to do. But I know now that trauma responses aren't choices. Freezing is as valid a survival response as fighting or fleeing. So no, there's nothing I could have done differently. The only person who could have done something differently was Father Richard. He could have chosen not to assault me. Everything that happened is his choice, his responsibility, his fault. Not mine. The courtroom was silent when Sarah finished. Walsh thanked her and turned her over for cross-examination. This was the part Sarah had been dreading. Father Richard's defense attorney, a man named Thomas Garrett who had a reputation for aggressive cross-examination, stood up and approached the witness stand. His strategy quickly became clear. He was going to try to poke holes in Sarah's account, suggest that her memory might be unreliable, imply that perhaps she'd misinterpreted Father Richard's intentions or actions. He asked why Sarah had initially been reluctant to report the assault. Sarah explained that she'd been in shock, traumatized, afraid she wouldn't be believed. Garrett suggested that maybe she'd been reluctant because she knew her accusation wasn't entirely accurate. Sarah firmly stated that wasn't the case, that her reluctance came from fear and trauma, not from uncertainty about what had happened. Garrett asked why Sarah had invited Father Richard into the bridal suite. Sarah corrected him, "I didn't invite him. I assumed when someone knocked that it was one of my bridesmaids. I said it was okay to come in without knowing who was there. And even if I had specifically invited him, that wouldn't give him permission to assault me." Garrett asked if Sarah had been drinking that morning, suggesting that alcohol might have impaired her judgment or memory. Sarah said she'd had one small glass of champagne with her bridesmaids hours before the assault, nowhere near enough to affect her memory or judgment. Garrett asked if Sarah had any financial motivation for making this accusation, whether she'd considered filing a civil lawsuit against the church. Sarah said that while she had filed a civil lawsuit, it had come after the criminal charges, and her motivation for reporting had never been financial but rather about justice and protecting other potential victims. With each question, Garrett tried to undermine Sarah's credibility, but Sarah remained calm and consistent, her answers clear and unwavering. Walsh had prepared her well, and Sarah understood that Garrett's job was to create doubt, that his aggressive questioning wasn't personal even though it felt that way. After about an hour of cross-examination, Garrett seemed to realize he wasn't making progress. Sarah's testimony was too consistent, too detailed, too clearly truthful. And he knew that the video evidence would corroborate everything she'd said, making any contradictions he might create largely meaningless. He ended his cross-examination, and Sarah was excused from the stand. She walked back to her seat next to Michael on legs that barely held her, and the moment she sat down, the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright drained away. Michael put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, exhausted but also feeling a strange sense of lightness. She'd done it. She'd told her truth in court, had faced her abuser, had withstood the defense attorney's attempts to discredit her. Whatever happened next, she'd done her part. Over the next several days, other victims testified, each telling a similar story of being targeted during vulnerable moments, of being assaulted in private settings, of being threatened or manipulated into silence. The cumulative weight of their testimony was devastating. The jury heard from Maria, who described being assaulted 17 years earlier and the subsequent institutional betrayal when she'd reported. They heard from Jessica, who'd been only 19 when Father Richard had violated her trust. They heard from the women who'd been discovered through the office camera footage, women who'd never reported but whose assaults had been documented nonetheless. Each victim's testimony was powerful individually, but together they painted an undeniable picture of a serial predator who'd been operating for decades. Then came the video evidence. Walsh had debated how to present this, knowing that showing the actual footage would be traumatic for the victims but that describing it might not have the same impact on the jury. She ultimately decided to show brief, carefully edited clips that demonstrated the key points: Father Richard entering the bridal suite and locking the door, Sarah's visible fear and attempts to back away, Father Richard's use of force, Sarah's distress during and after the assault. The clips were shown with a warning that the content was disturbing, and several jury members were visibly upset as they watched. One woman juror was crying openly. The video eliminated any possibility of arguing that these were consensual encounters or misunderstandings. The footage showed clear predatory behavior, clear lack of consent, clear violence. Father Richard's face as he watched the video being shown was carefully blank, but Sarah, watching him from the gallery, could see tension in his jaw, a slight tremor in his hands. He knew he was done. The video had destroyed any hope of acquittal. The defense's case was brief. Garrett called a few character witnesses who testified that Father Richard had always been kind and professional in their interactions, that they'd never seen any inappropriate behavior. But these testimonies rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Garrett didn't put Father Richard on the stand, knowing that cross-examination would be brutal and that there was no good way for him to explain the video evidence. In closing arguments, Walsh spoke directly to the jury about the courage it took for these women to come forward, about the clear pattern of predatory behavior, about the video evidence that removed all doubt. She asked them to hold Father Richard accountable, to send a message that no position of power or authority placed someone above the law, that victims would be believed and predators would face consequences. Garrett's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt, on the presumption of innocence, on the high burden of proof required for criminal conviction. But his heart didn't seem to be in it. He knew what the jury knew: Father Richard was guilty, and the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with a verdict, the courtroom was packed with victims, their families, media, and community members who'd been following the case. The foreperson stood and announced the verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Several victims began crying, some from relief, some from the release of tension they'd been holding for months or years. Sarah felt Michael's hand tighten around hers, and she realized she was crying too, tears streaming down her face as the weight of it all hit her. Father Richard showed emotion for the first time, his face crumpling, his shoulders sagging. The judge set a sentencing date for 6 weeks later and remanded Father Richard to custody pending sentencing. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at the courtroom one final time, and Sarah met his eyes. She wanted him to see that she'd survived, that his attempt to silence and destroy her had failed, that she was stronger than he'd ever imagined. At the sentencing hearing, each victim who wanted to was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement. Sarah went first, standing before the judge and Father Richard and speaking about how the assault had affected her life, her relationship with Michael, her sense of safety in the world. She spoke about the nightmares, the anxiety, the difficulty trusting anyone, the way her wedding day had been stolen from her. But she also spoke about her healing, about the support she'd received, about her determination not to let Father Richard's actions define her future. She ended by looking directly at Father Richard and saying, "You tried to take my power, my voice, my future. But you failed. I'm still here. I'm still strong. I'm still building a beautiful life. And you'll spend the rest of your life behind bars, where you belong." One by one, the other victims delivered their statements, each one powerful, each one adding to the portrait of the harm Father Richard had caused over his decades of predatory behavior. When they were finished, the judge spoke. He said this was one of the most disturbing cases he'd encountered in his years on the bench, that Father Richard had violated the most sacred trust people place in religious leaders, that he'd shown no remorse or acceptance of responsibility. The judge sentenced Father Richard to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. Given Father Richard's age, 63 at the time of sentencing, this was effectively a life sentence. He would be in his late 70s before he could even be considered for parole, and given the nature of his crimes, parole was unlikely. As Father Richard was led away to begin his sentence, Sarah felt a chapter closing. Justice had been served. The man who'd assaulted her and so many others was being held accountable. It didn't undo the trauma, didn't erase what had happened, but it mattered. It mattered that the truth had been acknowledged, that the victims had been believed, that consequences had finally caught up with a predator who'd operated with impunity for too long. The months following the trial were complicated. Sarah felt relief that Father Richard had been convicted, satisfaction that justice had been served, but also a strange emptiness. She'd been so focused on the trial, on preparing to testify, on supporting the other victims, that she hadn't fully processed her own trauma. Now, with the legal proceedings over, all that emotion came flooding back. She increased her therapy sessions, working with Dr. Lisa Chen, a trauma specialist who used a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR to help Sarah process what had happened. The work was hard, often painful, requiring Sarah to revisit memories she'd rather forget, to sit with emotions she'd rather avoid. But slowly, gradually, Sarah began to heal. She learned that healing didn't mean forgetting or moving on or being the person she was before the assault. Healing meant integrating the experience into her life story, acknowledging that it had changed her while refusing to let it define her. She learned to recognize her triggers, the situations or sensations that brought back memories of the assault, and develop strategies for managing them. She learned to challenge the negative thoughts that trauma had planted in her mind, the beliefs that she was damaged or weak or somehow responsible for what had happened. And she learned to celebrate small victories, the first time she went a whole day without thinking about the assault, the first time she felt safe being touched intimately, the first time she could tell her story without breaking down. Michael went through his own process during this time. He'd been so focused on supporting Sarah that he'd neglected his own emotional needs, and eventually, that caught up with him. He found himself struggling with anger that had nowhere to go, guilt that he couldn't logically justify but felt nonetheless, and a hypervigilance about Sarah's safety that was exhausting for both of them. His sister Jessica recommended a therapist who specialized in supporting partners of trauma survivors, and Michael started his own therapy journey. He learned about secondary trauma, how witnessing someone you love experience trauma can itself be traumatizing. He learned about the balance between being supportive and being overbearing, between wanting to protect Sarah from all possible harm and recognizing that she needed space to rebuild her own sense of agency and capability. He learned that taking care of his own mental health wasn't selfish but necessary, that he couldn't pour from an empty cup, that being a good partner meant being honest about his own struggles. 6 months after the trial, Sarah and Michael decided they were ready to try again with the wedding. Not a big ceremony with hundreds of guests, not a church wedding with all the traditional trappings. Something small and intimate and entirely theirs. They planned a simple ceremony in the backyard of Michael's sister's house, just immediate family and a handful of close friends. 20 people total. They wrote their own vows, and rather than a religious officiant, they asked Jessica to get ordained online and perform the ceremony. On a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, almost exactly a year after the day that should have been their wedding, Sarah walked across the grass toward Michael. She was wearing a simple white dress, not a wedding gown but something comfortable and beautiful that made her feel like herself. Michael was wearing a suit, standing under a wooden arch that his groomsmen had built and decorated with flowers. As Sarah approached, she saw tears in Michael's eyes, and she felt her own eyes filling. But these were happy tears, tears of joy and relief and the profound significance of this moment. They were finally doing this. They were finally getting married, on their terms, in a way that honored who they'd become through the hardest year of their lives. The ceremony was short, maybe 15 minutes, but every word felt meaningful. Sarah's vows spoke about Michael's steadiness in the storm, his unwavering support, his patience through her darkest days. She promised to love him not just in the easy times but in the hard ones, to communicate honestly even when it was uncomfortable, to build a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine friendship. Michael's vows spoke about Sarah's courage, her resilience, her refusal to let trauma steal her joy. He promised to be her safe place, to listen without judgment, to celebrate her victories and support her through setbacks, to build a life where both of them could thrive. When Jessica pronounced them married and they kissed, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah and Michael held each other, and for the first time in a year, Sarah felt completely present, completely at peace, completely hopeful about their future. The reception was casual, a backyard barbecue with Sarah's father grilling, music playing from a Bluetooth speaker, kids running around, adults laughing and telling stories. It was nothing like the elaborate reception they'd originally planned, and it was perfect precisely because it was real and authentic and joyful in a way that felt earned. At one point in the evening, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of the yard, looking back at the celebration, at Michael laughing with his groomsmen, at her sisters dancing with their kids, at her parents sitting together holding hands. She thought about how close she'd come to losing all of this, how the trauma could have destroyed her relationship with Michael, could have broken her completely. But it hadn't. She'd survived. They'd survived together. And they were building something beautiful from the wreckage. Sarah also continued her advocacy work in the months and years that followed. She became involved with a non-profit organization that supported survivors of clergy abuse, offering peer counseling, helping navigate the criminal justice system, advocating for policy changes that would better protect vulnerable people from predatory religious leaders. She testified before the state legislature in support of a bill that would eliminate statutes of limitations for sexual assault and require religious organizations to report abuse allegations to law enforcement rather than handling them internally. The bill passed, and Sarah was there when the governor signed it into law, standing with the other survivors who'd fought for this change. She also connected with the other women who'd testified against Father Richard, and together they formed a support group that met monthly. They called themselves the Cornerstone Survivors, reclaiming the name of the church where several of them had been victimized and transforming it into something that represented their strength rather than their trauma. The group became a lifeline for all of them, a space where they could be completely honest about their struggles without fear of judgment, where they could celebrate their progress without minimizing the ongoing challenges, where they could simply be with people who understood without explanation. One of the most powerful moments in Sarah's healing journey came about 2 years after the assault. She and Michael decided to try having a baby, and Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy brought up complicated emotions. Joy and excitement, certainly, but also anxiety about bringing a child into a world where predators existed, where people in positions of trust could betray that trust so completely. She worried about being a good mother when she was still working through her own trauma. She worried about passing on anxiety or fear to her child. But Dr. Chen helped her work through these concerns, helped her see that awareness of danger didn't mean she had to live in constant fear, that her experiences had given her tools to protect her child and teach them about boundaries and consent and trusting their instincts. When Sarah gave birth to a daughter, she and Michael named her Hope. The name was intentional, a declaration that their story wasn't defined by the trauma but by how they'd responded to it, by their choice to keep moving forward, to keep believing in the possibility of joy and connection and meaning despite having every reason to give up. Hope was a statement that darkness doesn't get the final word. As Sarah held her newborn daughter in the hospital, Michael sitting beside her with his arm around them both, she felt the weight of everything they'd been through and everything they'd overcome. She looked at Hope's tiny face and made a silent promise, "I will raise you to be strong, to trust your instincts, to know that your body belongs to you and no one else. I will teach you that speaking truth is more important than being polite, that your safety matters more than anyone's comfort with your boundaries. I will create a world where you never have to carry shame for someone else's actions." The impact of Sarah's case extended far beyond her individual healing. The conviction of Father Richard Chambers sent shockwaves through religious communities across the country, forcing uncomfortable but necessary conversations about power, accountability, and institutional protection of abusers. The diocese that had employed Father Richard faced enormous public pressure and eventually appointed an independent investigator to review all past complaints against clergy members. The investigation uncovered a systemic pattern of mishandling abuse allegations, prioritizing institutional reputation over victim protection, and moving problematic clergy to new assignments rather than removing them from ministry or reporting them to law enforcement. The findings led to the resignation of 3 high-ranking church officials and the implementation of new policies requiring immediate reporting of abuse allegations to law enforcement, mandatory training for all clergy and staff on recognizing and preventing abuse, and the establishment of a victim compensation fund. Other dioceses and religious organizations, seeing the public relations disaster and legal consequences faced by Father Richard's diocese, began reviewing their own policies and past handling of abuse allegations. Some did this proactively, genuinely committed to reform. Others did it defensively, trying to avoid similar scandals. But regardless of motivation, the result was increased awareness, better policies, and hopefully better protection for vulnerable people. Sarah's case also contributed to a broader cultural shift in how survivors were perceived and treated. The #MeToo movement had already begun changing conversations about sexual assault and harassment, but cases like Sarah's, with clear video evidence and multiple victims coming forward, made it harder for people to dismiss or minimize the prevalence of sexual violence. The stereotype of the perfect victim, someone who fought back physically, reported immediately, showed appropriate emotion, had no complicated history, was being challenged by the reality that trauma responses varied, that reporting was difficult for valid reasons, that victims were real people with complex lives who deserved to be believed regardless of whether they fit some idealized mold. Michael also became an advocate in his own way. In his high school classes, he incorporated lessons about consent, healthy relationships, recognizing warning signs of abusive behavior, and the importance of being an active bystander when you see something wrong. He trained students on how to support friends who disclosed trauma, how to recognize when someone needed help, how to challenge rape culture and victim-blaming attitudes. Some parents objected, saying these topics were inappropriate for school or should be taught at home. But Michael, backed by his principal who'd seen the positive impact of this education, held firm. He explained that teaching young people about consent and respect wasn't inappropriate, it was essential. That waiting until they were adults to have these conversations meant missing critical years when attitudes and behaviors were being formed. That silence didn't protect young people, it left them vulnerable. One of his former students, years later, sent him an email saying that his class about recognizing predatory behavior had helped her identify that her youth pastor was grooming her. She'd been able to set boundaries, tell her parents, and report his behavior before anything more serious happened. She credited Michael's teaching with potentially saving her from the kind of trauma Sarah had experienced. When Michael showed Sarah that email, they both cried. It was evidence that their experience, their willingness to speak publicly, their advocacy work, was making a real difference in real people's lives. The civil lawsuits filed by Sarah and other victims against the diocese were eventually settled for undisclosed amounts. Sarah and Michael used part of their settlement to establish a foundation that provided free counseling services to survivors of clergy abuse and funded prevention education programs in religious communities. They wanted something positive to come from the financial settlement, wanted to transform their pain into something that could help others. The foundation also funded research into institutional responses to abuse allegations, supporting academic studies that examined what policies were most effective at preventing abuse and protecting victims, what training was most successful at helping people recognize warning signs, and what accountability mechanisms actually resulted in meaningful reform. 3 years after the assault, Sarah was invited to speak at a national conference on preventing sexual violence in religious institutions. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, clergy members and administrators and advocates and survivors, Sarah felt the weight of her journey. She told her story, not dwelling on the graphic details but focusing on the systemic failures that had enabled Father Richard's decades of abuse, the courage it took to report, the importance of institutional accountability, and the possibility of healing. She talked about what religious communities could do differently: believe victims immediately and without qualification, report allegations to law enforcement rather than handling them internally, prioritize victim safety over institutional reputation, implement robust prevention training, create cultures where people feel safe speaking up, and hold leaders accountable regardless of their position or contributions to the community. She talked about what individuals could do: trust your instincts when something feels wrong, speak up when you witness boundary violations even if they seem minor, support survivors without questioning or judgment, challenge victim-blaming attitudes in your communities, and recognize that predators often hold positions of trust and authority, so don't dismiss allegations based on someone's reputation or role. The response to Sarah's speech was overwhelming. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Dozens of people lined up afterward to thank her, to share their own stories, to ask for advice on implementing changes in their own organizations. Several church leaders approached her with tears in their eyes, apologizing for the ways their institutions had failed survivors, committing to do better. Sarah left that conference exhausted but also energized. This was her purpose now, not the career she'd planned before the assault but something that had emerged from the trauma. She was making a difference, was helping create systemic change, was giving voice to survivors who'd been silenced. It didn't erase what had happened to her, but it gave it meaning, transformed her pain into something that could prevent others from experiencing similar pain. Michael, watching Sarah own her story and her advocacy, felt immense pride. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with, the one who saw injustice and wanted to fix it, who turned her own suffering into fuel for helping others. She'd been through hell, and she'd come out stronger, not because trauma made you stronger but because she'd done the hard work of healing and had chosen to use her experience to create change. 5 years after the assault, on what would have been their 5th wedding anniversary if they counted from the original date, Sarah and Michael took Hope, now 2 years old, and went back to the countryside where they'd had their actual wedding ceremony. They walked through the woods, Hope toddling between them holding both their hands, and they talked about how far they'd come. Sarah said that sometimes she still had nightmares, still had moments when the trauma felt overwhelming, still struggled with trusting people or feeling safe. But those moments were further apart now, less intense, no longer defining her daily experience. Michael said that he still felt protective, still worried about Sarah, but he'd learned to trust her resilience, to let her decide what she needed rather than trying to anticipate and prevent all possible difficulties. They'd learned to navigate trauma as a team, to communicate about triggers and needs, to give each other grace on the hard days. And they'd learned that their relationship was stronger because of what they'd been through, not in spite of it. Not because trauma was good or valuable, but because they'd faced it together, had chosen each other every day even when things were hard, had built something real and lasting on a foundation of mutual support and genuine partnership. They talked about hope, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, about how to teach her to be strong and kind and aware without making her afraid of the world. They talked about the balance between protecting her and letting her take appropriate risks, between teaching her about danger and allowing her to experience joy and trust. Sarah said she wanted Hope to grow up knowing that her voice mattered, that her boundaries mattered, that she had the right to say no to anyone about anything regarding her body or her comfort. Michael said he wanted Hope to grow up seeing a model of healthy partnership, of two people who communicated honestly and supported each other through difficulties. They wanted her to know that relationships took work, that conflict was normal, that love wasn't just a feeling but a daily choice. As they walked back to their car, Hope fell asleep in Michael's arms, her head on his shoulder, completely trusting and at peace. Sarah looked at them and felt a surge of gratitude for this life they'd built, imperfect and marked by trauma but also full of love and purpose and genuine connection. That evening, after Hope was in bed, Sarah and Michael sat on their back porch watching the sunset. Michael asked Sarah if she had any regrets, if there was anything she wished had gone differently. Sarah thought about this for a long time before answering. She said she wished the assault had never happened, obviously. She wished Father Richard had been stopped decades earlier before he could hurt so many women. She wished the systems that were supposed to protect people had actually done so. But she didn't regret reporting, didn't regret testifying, didn't regret going public with her story. She said that those decisions had been hard, had cost her privacy and peace and sometimes safety when hostile people targeted her. But they'd also given her purpose, had helped other survivors, had contributed to real systemic change. And that mattered. Michael said he was proud of her, which made Sarah laugh because he said that constantly. But he said he meant it every time, that watching her transform trauma into advocacy, watching her refuse to let Father Richard's actions define her future, watching her build a life full of meaning and connection, was the privilege of his life. Sarah leaned into him, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun dropped below the horizon and the first stars appeared. So that's Sarah and Michael's story. A story of trauma and survival, of justice and accountability, of healing and advocacy. A story that began with one of the worst things that can happen to a person and ended with purpose, meaning, and hope. But this isn't just Sarah's story. It's a story that plays out thousands of times every day, in every community, in contexts both religious and secular. Sexual assault is one of the most common violent crimes, yet it remains one of the most underreported. And the reasons for underreporting are exactly what Sarah experienced: fear of not being believed, shame and self-blame, concern about the impact on relationships and reputation, distrust of systems that often fail survivors. So what can we take from Sarah's story? What lessons apply to our own lives? First, trust your instincts. Michael's decision to check on Sarah, driven by nothing more than a gut feeling that something was wrong, was crucial. How often do we sense that something is off but talk ourselves out of acting because we don't want to seem paranoid or intrusive? Sarah's story reminds us that those instincts matter, that paying attention to subtle cues can literally save someone. Second, believe survivors. When Sarah finally told Michael what happened, he didn't question her, didn't ask what she'd been wearing or whether she'd been drinking or what she might have done to invite the assault. He believed her immediately and focused on what she needed. That belief, that lack of judgment, was foundational to her healing. We can all commit to being that person for the survivors in our lives. Third, report abuse even when it's difficult. Sarah's initial instinct was to stay silent, to try to pretend nothing happened, to avoid the exposure and judgment that comes with reporting. But she chose to report anyway, and that decision not only brought her justice but also protected future potential victims and exposed a predator who'd been operating for decades. Reporting is never easy, and the decision belongs entirely to the survivor, but Sarah's story shows us why it matters. Fourth, hold institutions accountable. The diocese that employed Father Richard knew about complaints against him and chose to protect their reputation rather than protect vulnerable people. That institutional failure enabled decades of abuse. We need to demand better from the organizations we're part of, whether they're religious institutions, schools, workplaces, or any other setting where people hold power over others. Accountability can't just be about individuals. It has to be about systems too. Fifth, healing is possible but it's not linear. Sarah didn't just recover and move on. She went through years of therapy, had setbacks and breakthroughs, struggled with triggers and trauma responses. But gradually, she rebuilt her life and found purpose in her pain. If you're a survivor watching this, know that healing doesn't mean forgetting or being the person you were before. It means integrating your experience, learning to live with it rather than being consumed by it, and discovering that you're stronger than you knew. Sixth, supporting survivors means showing up consistently. Michael didn't have all the answers. He made mistakes, struggled with his own emotions, didn't always know the right thing to say or do. But he stayed. He was present. He listened without judgment. He let Sarah's healing happen at her own pace. That consistency, that reliable presence, was what Sarah needed most. If someone you love has experienced trauma, the greatest gift you can offer is your steady, patient, non-judgmental presence. And finally, speaking truth creates change. Sarah's decision to go public with her story, to give interviews, to testify at legislative hearings, to speak at conferences, contributed to real systemic change. Policy reforms, increased awareness, other survivors finding the courage to come forward, prevention education reaching young people who could now recognize warning signs. None of that would have happened if Sarah had stayed silent. Her courage created ripples that extended far beyond her individual case. Now I want to ask you some questions. How would you have responded if you were in Michael's position? If someone you loved told you they'd been assaulted by someone you trusted, someone respected in your community, would you have believed them immediately? Would you have been able to set aside your own emotions to focus on what they needed? And if you were in Sarah's position, do you think you would have had the courage to report? To testify? To go public? It's easy to say yes when we're watching someone else's story, but the reality is that reporting sexual assault requires extraordinary courage because our systems often fail survivors. How would you handle the disbelief, the invasive questions, the victim blaming, the exposure of your most private trauma? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're important ones. Because until we're willing to honestly confront how we might respond in these situations, we can't create the cultural change necessary to actually support survivors and prevent abuse. Think about the institutions you're part of. Your workplace, your church or religious community, your children's schools, your social organizations. Do they have clear policies for handling abuse allegations? Do they prioritize victim safety over institutional reputation? Do they provide training on recognizing and preventing abuse? If you don't know the answers to these questions, find out. And if the answers aren't good enough, push for change. You have more power than you think to influence the cultures of the organizations you're part of. And if you're someone who has experienced sexual assault and hasn't reported it, Sarah's story isn't meant to make you feel guilty for that choice. The decision to report belongs entirely to you, and there are valid reasons why many survivors choose not to report. But I want you to know that if you do decide to speak up, there are people who will believe you, support you, and fight for you. The systems are imperfect, absolutely, but they're slowly getting better, in large part because of survivors like Sarah who've been willing to face those imperfect systems and demand accountability. Resources are available. The National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673 provides confidential support 24/7. Organizations like RAIN offer information about your options, can help you navigate the criminal justice system if you choose to report, and can connect you with local resources for counseling and support. You're not alone, even if trauma has made you feel isolated and disconnected. There are communities of survivors who understand, who believe you, who will walk with you through healing. Sarah's story, as dark as it began, ultimately shows us that justice is possible, that healing is possible, that transformation is possible. Father Richard, who operated with impunity for decades, who believed he was untouchable because of his position and the institutional power protecting him, is now spending what will likely be the rest of his life in prison. The diocese that enabled his abuse has been forced to implement reforms and compensate victims. Other potential victims have been protected because Sarah spoke up. And Sarah herself, though forever changed by what she experienced, has built a beautiful life full of purpose, love, and meaning. That's the power of courage. That's the power of speaking truth. That's the power of refusing to let darkness have the final word. Before we end, I want to acknowledge something important. This story is heavy. If watching it has brought up difficult emotions or memories, please take care of yourself. Reach out to someone you trust. Contact a hotline if you need immediate support. Take a break from social media and news if you need space to process. Healing isn't a straight line, and sometimes hearing other people's trauma stories can trigger our own. That's normal and okay. Be gentle with yourself. And if this story has made you angry, channel that anger into action. Support organizations that serve survivors. Vote for legislators who prioritize victim protection and accountability. Have conversations in your own communities about consent, boundaries, and believing survivors. Push for policy changes in your workplace or church. Teach the young people in your life about healthy relationships and bodily autonomy. Small actions, multiplied across thousands of people, create cultural shifts. You don't have to do everything, but do something. Sarah's story matters because it's not unique. It's a pattern that plays out constantly in every community. But it also matters because it shows us that change is possible. That predators can be held accountable. That institutions can be forced to reform. That survivors can heal and thrive and use their experiences to help others. That darkness, no matter how overwhelming it seems in the moment, doesn't get to write the ending of the story. So what will you do with this story? Will you let it fade from your memory as you scroll to the next video, or will you let it change something in you, in your perspective, in your actions? Will you be the person who believes survivors without hesitation? Will you be the person who trusts their instincts and checks on someone when something feels off? Will you be the person who demands accountability from institutions rather than accepting their excuses? Will you be the person who shows up consistently for someone going through trauma? The choice is yours. And maybe that's the ultimate message of Sarah's story: we all have choices. Father Richard chose to use his power to harm vulnerable people. The diocese chose to protect its reputation over protecting victims. Sarah chose to report despite her fear. Michael chose to trust his instincts and believe Sarah without question. The other victims chose to come forward and add their voices to the call for justice. The prosecutor chose to build a comprehensive case rather than just pursuing the easiest charges. The jury chose to believe survivors over a man in a position of authority. The legislature chose to pass reforms that would better protect future victims. Every person in this story made choices, and those choices had consequences that rippled outward in ways both seen and unseen. What choices will you make? Because here's the truth, you will encounter survivors in your life, whether you know it or not. Statistically, someone you love, someone you work with, someone you worship with, has experienced sexual assault. And how you respond when they trust you with their story matters enormously. You will encounter situations where your instincts tell you something is wrong, where you notice boundary violations or concerning behavior. How you respond in those moments could prevent harm. You will be part of institutions and organizations that have policies, cultures, and leadership. Whether you push those institutions toward accountability and transparency or accept the status quo matters. Sarah's story is a call to action for all of us. Not just to support survivors after harm has occurred, though that's crucial. But to create cultures and systems that prevent harm in the first place. To raise children who understand consent and boundaries. To challenge attitudes that excuse or minimize sexual violence. To build communities where speaking truth is celebrated rather than punished, where vulnerability is met with compassion rather than judgment, where power is held accountable rather than protected. This is heavy work. It's uncomfortable work. It requires us to confront systems we benefit from, to question authorities we're taught to trust, to examine our own biases and assumptions. But it's necessary work if we want to create a world where stories like Sarah's become increasingly rare rather than devastatingly common. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. Thank you for being willing to sit with the discomfort, to hear the truth, to consider how you might respond. If this video resonated with you, if it made you think differently about trust or trauma or justice or courage, please share it. Not for the views or the algorithm, but because someone in your life might need to hear Sarah's story. Someone might need to know they're not alone. Someone might need permission to speak their own truth. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We share real stories that matter, stories that challenge us to be better, to do better, to create change in our own spheres of influence. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Drop a comment telling us what you thought of this story, what it made you feel, what you're going to do differently because you heard it. Let's build a community of people committed to believing survivors, preventing harm, and creating justice. Sarah's story began in a church on what should have been the happiest day of her life. It continued through trauma, through reporting, through a trial, through healing, through advocacy. But it doesn't end there. It continues in every person who hears her story and chooses to respond differently the next time they encounter a survivor. It continues in every institution that reforms its policies because of cases like hers. It continues in every young person who learns about consent and boundaries and trusting their instincts. Sarah's courage created ripples that are still spreading, touching lives she'll never know about, preventing harm that will never be documented because it never occurred. That's the power of one person choosing to speak truth even when silence would be easier. That's the power of one person refusing to let trauma define their future. That's the power of one person transforming their pain into purpose. And that power is available to all of us. We might not all experience trauma on the scale Sarah did, but we all face moments where we have to choose between speaking up and staying silent, between believing someone and dismissing them, between demanding accountability and accepting excuses. The choices we make in those moments matter. They create the culture we all live in. They determine whether predators operate with impunity or face consequences. They shape whether survivors feel safe speaking up or feel forced into silence. So I'll ask you one final time, what will you do with Sarah's story? How will it change you? What action will you take, however small, to create a world where survivors are believed, where institutions prioritize people over reputation, where justice is accessible, where healing is supported, where prevention is prioritized? Don't just watch and scroll on. Let this story mean something. Let it move you to action. Let Sarah's courage inspire your own. Because that's how we create change. Not through grand gestures or perfect solutions, but through thousands of individual choices to do better, to be better, to demand better. Sarah chose courage over comfort. Michael chose belief over doubt. The other survivors chose truth over silence. The jury chose justice over power. The legislature chose reform over status quo. What will you choose? Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing Sarah's story. Thank you for caring enough to watch all the way to the end. Now go out and make it matter. Make it count. Use what you've learned here to create change in your own corner of the world. And know that in doing so, you're part of something bigger than yourself. You're part of a movement toward justice, toward accountability, toward healing, toward hope. That's Sarah's legacy. Not just her own survival and healing, but the way her courage has inspired countless others to speak up, to stand up, to refuse to accept that abuse is inevitable or that predators are untouchable. Her story proves that change is possible. That justice, though difficult to achieve, is achievable. That healing, though not linear, is real. That hope, even after the darkest trauma, can be rebuilt. That's what I want you to take from this story. Not just the horror of what happened, but the hope of what came after. Not just the injustice Sarah experienced, but the justice she fought for and won. Not just her trauma, but her transformation. We'll see you in the next video with another story that matters, another truth that needs telling, another call to action that needs hearing. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. Believe survivors. Trust your instincts. Demand accountability. And never underestimate the power of your own courage to create change. This has been the story of Sarah, Michael, and what happened when a priest violated the most sacred trust on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. But more than that, it's been a story about the power of truth, the possibility of justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.